Hi, and welcome to Dog the Cynic. And today I want to talk a little bit about scaling up the FGC. And while I'm talking about this, I'm making two basic assumptions. First off, that we still want to grow the FGC. And secondly, that we want to keep the core aspects of the FGC. We don't want to have an Overwatch League where it's like we only play Street Fighter at this event and nothing else, and that's the only kind of event we have. And given those two assumptions, I'm going to look a little bit into some of the proposals given and why they might be slightly problematic. And I'll provide my own pie in the eye solution, which is also problematic in its own different way, but I think is helpful because it allows the FGC to sort of keep its fate in its own hands instead of relying on either developer support or outside money coming in to save us. So we're inundated with the idea that esports is the next big thing or the next big bubble, depending on who you ask. And we look at the money being paid out to Fortnite, to Overwatch, and all the money just getting dumped in there and thinking, why is the FGC so comparatively poor compared to those other games? And I mean, it's a good question. Some of it's simple economics. There are just simply way more people playing, Fortnite than there are playing fighting games. But I think there are other issues that kind of tie into that. One is the business models the developers take, and part of that is sort of the FGC has always been semi-ambivalent towards the idea of esports to a degree that I don't think I've ever seen in other, I guess, more, if you want to call them modern esports like Rocket League and the like. And I'm just going to touch a little bit on that. So the FGC is organic, and we're ambivalent because we've had, shall we say, a mixed record with the larger, broader esports community, specifically MLG and EVO, and that's all that stuff. But the legacy of the FGC it's over 30 years old, and a lot of it, for most of its history, it's been benign neglect. The developers generally don't go out of their way to stop us. Nintendo may be an exception every now and then, but they also were, for the most part, not really involved in the entire scene until quite recently. And part of it is there's a fear when we look at something like the Overwatch League or LCS, there's a fear of gentrification, a fear of losing that core of the FGC, that the community members who built the FGC will somehow be pushed out in favor of like more bland corporatism. And this is a complaint that's been voiced by Momochi. I believe it's been voiced by Mike Ross. And I think it is a serious complaint, and gentrification is a big issue far beyond the scope of, my meager capabilities in this video. But I think it's a legitimate complaint. And finally, the FGC is fragmented across games and location. It's always been bottom up, not top down, in terms of like, we've always, done things ourselves. That's always been kind of the bootstrapping thing. And like the actual publisher be damned. We don't really have the same kind of top down where Overwatch League basically said, okay, we are going to kill the current what Overwatch has launched. There was kind of like, I'd say, a larval esports scene growing up. Blizzard basically killed that. And I just find it very difficult to see that happening in the FGC without sort of a huge amount of outcry. So now that we've kind of talked a little bit about why the FGC is ambivalent towards esports and why it doesn't really fit into the esports model, I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the approaches are to scaling up that I've heard, and why they probably don't get us where we need to be. The benefits of scaling up the FGC are fairly obvious. A rising tide lifts all boats. More people can earn a living in the FGC, be they content creators, be they tournament organizers, competitors, and ideally, I'd love for the lifeblood of the FGC, the volunteers, the bracket runners, to be able to be paid for their services instead of just volunteering because they're really passionate about it. Passion can sometimes be an excuse for working below minimum wage. So I'm going to touch briefly on the couple of the two big ideas I see floated around. First of all is that we demand more money from the publishers. I am not certain that would work very well because the FGC one is not as big as Fortnite. It doesn't. I do not think it does. It warrants a kind of league like Overwatch League or something like that, where you can sell media rights and sell, franchise spots. And I think most people would agree with that. And given that the FGC, for the most part, most publishers are operating under the idea of esports as a marketing expense, there's an upper limit to how much money they can put into it. And I would argue that we are probably closer to that limit than we think. And there's also the issue that this isn't in our control. We basically have to, send tweets or, beg the publishers for more money. And for them, it'll probably be a simple sort of cost-benefit analysis. Right. In the case of somebody like Nintendo, in fact, they kind of have a vested interest, I would argue, in making sure that competitive Smash as it's played on the tournament level is not considered the right way to play Smash because their casual base is so large. The second idea I've heard is we should increase tournament fees or venue fees. And I can see the argument there being that like venue fees have not kept pace of inflation, and that money can go into, the prize pool and what have you. There are a couple of issues with that, I think. First of all, like I would argue that you're squeezing blood from a stone. The FGC, when you increase the rates of anything, right, you naturally expect some sort of attrition from attendees and whatnot. And it's hard for me to see how like increasing the venue fees or what have you is going to attract more people to actually come to the event, especially given that like this is all done in sort of the idea of like, well, we should pay, like the top players more. Like if you're a casual looking to maybe get into the FGC, like, and you see like a tournament fee of $30, $40, there's some breakpoint where you're like, well, I'm not seeing any of that anyways, right? I'm just going for the event. And it's just not clear to me that it's going to add all that much more. So what can we do then to scale up the FGC, right? To kind of do it, but still keep it within our control, right? Besides, like, I mean, obviously one easy way would just to get like a VC to come in and just sort of swing their fiscal power around and just buy everything out. But we're, again, trying to keep it within the community. And this is where my proposal comes in, wherein we start looking at the idea that, okay, EVO is big, but it's not necessarily big enough to get consistent non-endemic sponsors. And non-endemic sponsors are, sponsors not, not within the FGC. So for example, not like Vitrix, you want to get something like Coca-Cola or Casio or something to that effect. And the idea is EVO is big. It's really big. It gets a couple 100,000 views. I mean, it dominates the media cycle. But the problem is that it happens over a weekend, and during that weekend, it's competing also with sort of like publisher reveals and that sort of thing. So if you're a non-endemic sponsor, 2 days where you don't have the whole platform to yourself is not a lot of time. And this runs true for CEO, Combo Breaker, Biggie, etc. It's too infrequent and it's too compressed. These individual events, even though they're big, and we do attract sponsors, right? I believe East Coast Throwdown got Roadrunner Records and the like. But that benefits East Coast Throwdown, but probably not the FGC as a whole. And we can't really rely on publisher events and publisher pot pools because by definition, they only benefit a small subset of the FGC, right? Like Capcom putting money into the Street Fighter pool does very little to help the BB tag, community from a payout perspective. So what is my pie in the sky proposal? Well, the idea is there's generally two business models. I think the Netscape CEO argued that there were two business models. You either bundle or you unbundle. And my argument is, well, why don't we try bundling everything together? So again, EVO, Combo Breaker, CEO, the big events, individually, they're not big enough to sort of appeal to, say, a Coke, right? So why don't we try lumping everything together and pitching as one, coherent body, right? Where we can say like, look, if you sign up to our fighting game body, and I'll provide a link to my previous discussion about, whether or not the FGC is still a community anymore. But you have one sales deck you pitch as somebody like Casio and G-Shock, and you say like, look, if you agree to sort of like sponsor us, you will be at all these events, right? With the unique user base, like varying times and, varying, regions and all that sort of stuff, right? And you can market specifically to each individual event if you choose to, but you have a much bigger pool from you to appeal to these larger sort of non-endemic sponsors. And while I don't work in marketing, I suspect that many of the issues they face are similar, wherein like Whether or not you sign a deal for $1 million or $5 million or $10 million, generally speaking, the due diligence is not very far removed. So if you're going to spend the same amount of time and look to get the same amount of bang for your buck, something like Evo probably doesn't raise the needle so much as like an entire conglomeration of the FGC. Now, this approach sounds great in paper, but it's also very, very problematic in its own way. First of all, you need to decide how to split the ad revenue, right? Evo is going to say, "Hey, we're the biggest. We deserve the most ad revenue," right? And how do you go about one, establishing the norms, right? How do we establish like, okay, this is how we split the ad revenue. This is how we split like how we're going to position the product and how we're going to do all those things. And part of that is because there's not a lot of transparency in terms of like the economics behind running a tournament. And I'm going to link to a post, to a tweet that Valle mentioned when an individual asked him like, well, help me understand the sort of economics of, what are the margins like, or what are the percentages or the cost breakdown of running a tournament. And Valle said, well, you should run your own tournament. And I think he means well, because there are so many variables in terms of like, obviously running a tournament in Boise, Idaho is going to be significantly cheaper than running it in Manhattan, New York. How many games are going to be there? Are the publishers supporting it, et cetera, et cetera. But it's still an issue that the fact that there's like no, at least rough guideline is a little shocking to me. And none of that's going to be resolved unless the FGC kind of comes together and opens their book. And I don't think this is an example of people being venal or being excessively parochial. I think it's just simply there's no equivalent of a 10K filing for the FGC. People, tournaments run their own books, and I doubt they have those numbers in their head right at the top of right at the beginning. And the really only way to solve that issue is for the heads of the FGC to come together and say, this is an important thing. This is something that we can do. Now, the other issue you're going to run into is, again, that fear of dilution, that fear of homogenization, right? If everybody's running Coke ads, right? What if Coke demands that we can't play Mortal Kombat, for example? It's just too violent, right? Is that an avenue you want to go down? And that's a risk we run, and that's why I think it's important that we sort of group together as like an association where we can start having these sorts of discussions. This idea of bundling a bunch of individually perhaps less appealing, that's probably not the right word, but less economic sort of products into one large sort of pool is not a new one, right? It's been used in finance, it's been used in motorsport, etc. So basically, the conclusion is that individually the FGC is small. As a group, we're probably less so. We're going to be much more appealing to non-endemic sponsors, and we can even include potentially like one of the discussions. Why don't we include content producers into this, right? To provide multiple avenues for these non-endemics, to provide sort of like an entire solution for them. That's a corporate talk there. And it also, by sort of creating the association and approaching non-endemic sponsors, right, we get to choose which sponsors we think work well with the FGC, right? We are probably not going to be sponsors with, I don't know, Patek Philippe. We would be looking for, products that appeal to the FGC that are, that kind of keep the core of what makes the FGC interesting. And I think in the near future, I want to talk a little bit about why companies or why we can use F1, especially during their boom in the 1960s or so, as a model for the FGC going forward in terms of secure non-endemic sponsors. But thank you for your time. This went a little long. And if you have any feedback, please let me know, and have a wonderful day.